Quick question.
Yep.
Of the different compilers.yaml files, which one are we editing here?
This is the one in home directory /.spack/linux/compilers.yaml. That's the default. The Spack config command, you can pass it a scope, so you could tell it which one to open if you wanted to do it at a different scope.
Great, thank you.
So what have we done here? This is all the information about a compiler. We've left environment, extra RPaths, flags, modules alone. We'll talk about those later. We've said we have another compiler for Ubuntu 16, target x86-64. And we've updated the paths. It's got the same paths that we had before for C and C++. And then we just updated the Fortran paths to point at the G4 that we already knew about. And then we've changed the version, so that instead of saying clang at 3.8.0 Ubuntu, we've just put G4 in there so that we can tell it apart in the spec. So now we close that. We can say Spack compiler list. And I broke something in the file.
It's because you're using Max, right?
Obviously. So I left one of these things starting with a tab.
Search for it.
It was the extra line at the end. And so now we can see we've got our extra clang 3.8.0 G4, and now we can actually use it. Spack install. We're going to say -- no cache to tell it to ignore the cache. Of course, it would also not find this in the cache because we just created this compiler, but this is an excuse to learn the no cache option. And we're going to say clang at 3.8.0 -G4.
Missing an off G4.
And we can see this compiler works. Well, that's not that surprising. We didn't actually change anything about what it does for C code. But we can also say Spack install cfits.io. We'll say without bzip, so that it compiles quickly. Yeah. Without bzip 2. And we'll say with clang at 3.8.0 -G4. I got the R this time. And since I didn't put no cache, it looks in the binary still. It says, oh, I didn't find one, and it continues on to build it. And you can take my word for it or not, but cfits.io actually does use Fortran. And so we're actually testing that compiler out, and it takes a second longer than zlib to build.
What would happen if you tried to build cfits.io with this combination without editing?
It would just fail. It would say, I don't have a Fortran compiler. So do we want to test that out? We can say the default clang should be the other one. Assuming it does not do anything incredibly clever in configure.
forget to install dash verbose, you can just type V.
Yeah, and you can type it again to stop it. So it looks like cfizio actually can somehow manage to build without a Fortran compiler.
It is C fits
Yeah. Well, it does use the Fortran compiler when you build it with Fortran, apparently. Yeah. Anyway. So, we talked earlier about compiler flags from the command line saying, I want to build this with these compiler flags. There's another use for compiler flags in Spack where you say, every time I use this compiler, I want these flags. So if we edit our compiler's config again, we can go to the flags, and we can say CPP flags -G. Now this is not C++ flags. This is the C preprocessor flags, which get applied to C, C++, and Fortran. So we're saying everywhere, throw -G. Maybe we're abusing the preprocessor flags a little bit. And if we close that out, we can now say Spack spec cfizio playing at 380-G Fortran. And we'll use the spec command so that we don't have to actually build every time. And you can see that it added the flags to the spec, just the same as if you'd put them on the command line. Every time we use that compiler, we'll get those flags now. So what else can we do in compiler configuration? We can add extra RPaths. I mentioned I was going to talk about how do you set up the Intel compiler, right? The Intel compiler needs to know where libimf is. And I think there might be some other libraries in that same place. So you can say extra RPaths, here's the location of the libraries that the Intel compiler doesn't know how to find on its own. The environment field, you can set environment variables there. Often that's the Intel license file if you don't have your compilers configured in such a way that they automatically find their license file. You can also use modules. That's primarily used on the Cray systems, right? That's how we find all of the compilers on the Cray systems. But you can also use that if you have an Intel compiler module that sets the LD library path and sets the Intel file license. Instead of setting the extra RPaths and the environment variable, you could just tell Spack, hey, load this module every time I run this compiler. And that can be used to find libraries and license files also. So there's two different ways that we can handle the Intel compiler there. But those are also useful for other compilers. I think the PGI compiler, often people set an environment variable for example. Any questions on configuring compilers?
Is there an easy way to see where compiler options came from? So if we define in system compiler YAML correct configuration for our principal compilers for everybody, and then a user goes and changes that and breaks the build and comes back to us and says, why don't we build?
Spack config blame on any of these sections gives you the file and line number where the constraint, so it prints, Spack config get just prints out the merged config from every scope. Spack config blame, you get that same merged config, but you get the file and line number for each one where it's coming from.
And it color codes the file.
Yes, that makes it easier to tell. Anything else?
Got one.
Yeah.
If I change the configuration, suppose I build something, bunch of things for the compiler, and then I change the configuration for that compiler. In some sense, I've invalidated previous builds. Does that,
It depends exactly what you've changed.
okay,
With compilers, so we hash the spec and the compiler flags get put on the spec as well. The other compiler information currently does not. So this is an example. We talked earlier about the install-f option. Really get rid of it. The things that depend on it are going to break, but I don't care. Why might you do that? Well, one way that you could do that is, I know I'm about to reinstall it again, exactly the same from Spack's perspective, but I changed something that Spack doesn't hash. If that comes up often, maybe there would be a conversation about, hey, this belongs in the hash, and we could talk with you about that, but that is a way to work around it.
We'll have more, I mean, I guess, so for the long-term plan, like, we would like to make the compilers proper dependencies so that you can have variants and options on them as you can on regular packages. They're currently handled specially because they are kind of special. We have wrappers around them. We put them in the build that we don't do with the packages. We wanted to allow mixing the compilers, but we're trying to have a way to do that where they are also dependencies. So I think we'll have a better solution for that in the future, but this is what we're doing right now. We trust you.
Any other questions? Yeah.
Along the line of Intel compiler doesn't even know where its own libraries are.
Yep.
We also encountered this problem that internally it loads its own shared library where the shared library doesn't have the RPAR etched onto it.
Mm-hmm.
So unless we set it for Intel compiler, every library, but it doesn't work. Do you handle that by any chance?
That's true for, so with a real RPath, you can fix that. So you can put the extra RPaths on the extra. For RunPath, if you're using RunPath, you cannot fix that because the RunPath search is different. And so, are you using RPath or RunPath?
We are using RPath.
Okay.
Still,
Are you sure you're using RPath? Because
Yeah.
it can be mysterious.
yeah, no,
Like,
WL, RPath, and that's the command we use.
Yeah,
yes,
but if you're
that's
on,
the same command for RunPath.
Yeah.
And it's whether or not you have enabled new D tags, or whether that's the default on your system that determines whether it's RPath or RunPath. So we can talk about this offline, but yes, that is annoying to us. We're working on having better semantics for handling RunPath. That's also something that we would probably relocate on our installed executable. So like we have a PR right now where we're working on how to relocate libstandard C++. So that if you built something with one version of libstandard C++ and you install it on a system that speaks that libstandard C++ from like a different compiler, that we could potentially do that. But that's not in there right now. So yeah, that'll be a problem. May have been too much.
other questions on configuring compilers? All right, I'll go on to configuring packages, or package preferences. So, start with, we can say Spack config scope defaults, edit packages, and we're only going to look at the configuration here. You should never change this. Use one of the other scopes to override it. But here's the default that we ship with, and you can see we set a few things. We set what compilers do we prefer in some order. For all of the virtual dependencies, we set at least one preferred provider for it. If it's not in the providers list here, that doesn't mean you can't use it, or that Spack won't use it. It just means that Spack won't consider it to be particularly preferred over any other version. And then we also have here permissions. Packages are installed, world readable, user writable.
maybe mention that you can actually have per package permission.
Yeah. So, using the defaults, we did this earlier, we installed HDF5. But using the defaults, we can remember we got OpenMPI and we got GCC 5.4.0. And we saw we prefer GCC, and we'll take the newest version of things generally by default. So let's change that. So I did Spack config edit packages. This will open in your user home directory .spack/packages.yaml is the default place where it will edit those. All, and we'll say the compiler we've moved Clang to the front of the list. And we've said our providers for MPI, we prefer MPitch over OpenMPI over anything else. Now, if we do Spack HDF5 again, we can see we get MPitch, and we're building with Clang.
That might change if we put some kind of restriction on it that either Clang or MPitch did not meet.
Yeah, like if we said with GCC, it's going to do that. If it...
Currently, that's really the only place where that is.
Yeah, if... Let's say something in here depended on MPitch specifically, or OpenMPI specifically. Mm-hmm. That constraint would filter up. It would say, okay, I depend on MPI, I prefer MPitch, but looking down here, I can't use MPitch, I'm going to use OpenMPI. So, in addition to the providers and the compilers, we can also configure variant preferences, although none are enabled by default. So Spack config edit packages again, and we can say variants will prefer turning shared libraries off. And if we do Spack HDF5 again, we can see that now everything that has a shared variant has it turned off. Here, here, and here. And if you happen to have looked at it before, when we installed it before, those were all default on. Generally in Spack, things that can build with or without their shared libraries have a shared variant default on, and now we've turned that off. That's just a community convention. So far we've only made global changes to the packages. Right? Everything has been under this all heading. What if we just wanted to change our configuration for HDF5? So we'll add a key for HDF5, and we'll say variants. We want to build HDF5 without MPI by default, but everything else we want to leave its default MPI alone, or default MPI variant alone. And we can say Spack HDF5, and you'll see we get serial HDF5, MPI is turned off. Shared is on now because we've overridden the variants. If we want shared to still be off for HDF5, we have to do that. So everything that we looked at, either in our user packages config or in the defaults packages config, the preferences or the permissions can also be set for an individual package. In addition to what we saw, you can also set the group for a package to a particular group. Any other questions on the preferences real quick before I go on to externally installed packages?
Can you just say a little bit more about what a group is for a package? Maybe I missed that.
So Unix groups for permissions. You can set the Unix group that a package is owned by, and then you can change the permission granularity is you have read and write user, group, or world. By default, it gets the group of its owner. And
I didn't think of you. Does that also work with ACLs?
No, we have no support for ACLs in at the moment. And
That would be an awesome feature contribution.
the execute permissions are set the same as the read permissions on files that the build system designates as executable. We tried to think of a use case where you would want to install something readable but not executable, and we couldn't come up with one.
Well, if it's already executable.
Yeah, if it's already executable. So external packages. What do you do when you've already got MPI on your system optimized or something else, and you don't want Spack to build its own, you want Spack to just look at that? Todd mentioned we have a way of configuring Spack to look at something that's installed externally. It will just trim that portion of the dependency DAG and put in the external path. So let's do that. And we'll do it first with zlib. So Spack config edit. Actually, I think I have this still open. Yep, there we go. So let's say zlib. We can say paths where zlib is available. And what's available? Well, zlib at 1.2.8, built with GCC at 5.4.0, Arch equals Linux, Ubuntu 16.04, x86-64. That's the spec. That's all of the description of the spec that I know for what APT happened to install on this system when I said to install zlib. So we're giving Spack as much provenance as we can. Where is it? It's in /user. If you look in /user, you'll see the same layout of zlib that you would see if you installed zlib anywhere else. Now, if we do Spack HDF5, we get it built with that zlib. There we go. Except that's overriding our preferences because we said we preferred Clang. Spack's saying, okay, I have this external zlib, and Spack's saying, okay, I should unify the compilers. Since you didn't say anything, I'll unify them, and I'll give you GCC. So, if we want to still use Clang, we'll have to say so. Well, that's fine. We know how to say we want to use Clang. Great. But now look what happened. We're not using that external zlib anymore because we said use Clang, And Spack said, okay, well, I don't have a Clang-built version of zlib externally, so I'll just build my own. Now, that's not really what we want either. We want to force it to use the one that we said externally, even though it's a different compiler. We know it's zlib, it's a very simple binary interface, and it's going to work. So we can say, in our config, we can say buildable false for zlib. That says, Spack, you're not allowed to build zlib for yourself anymore. You have to use this one that we've configured, even if it breaks other rules that you want to follow. All right. And now, even when we say Spack spec HDF5 with Clang, concretize HDF5 with the Clang compiler, it says, well, I'm not allowed to build zlib, so I'm going to have to use this external one, even though it's with a different compiler. So now we've configured Spack to use that zlib either way. It gets a little bit more complicated with virtual dependencies. So we've configured mpitch to be our preferred provider for MPI. And we actually have mpitch installed on these VMs also. And it's mpitch 3.2, built with the system compiler is GCC 540. Device equals CH3. It's built with Hydra. Netmod equals TCP, plus PMI, plus ROM.io, without verbs. Arch equals Linux, Ubuntu 16.04, x86 64. That's everything I know about that mpitch. It's also in /user. And as we learned earlier, we want to say buildable is false. Sorry, I accidentally went back a page. All right. So now, we have to tell HDF5 to build with MPI, since we said by default not to. With Clang. And now look what happens. We build with OpenMPI. Because what happened? Spack said, all right, I prefer to build with mpitch. I've got this external mpitch. I can't build a new one. This external mpitch doesn't match the compiler I'm building with. Well, I guess I'll give up on mpitch and try OpenMPI. That's a reasonable thing for Spack to do if it's committed to keeping the compiler the same. But what if you're really committed to using this GCC-built mpitch even when you're using the Clang compiler? Then what you have to do is you have to tell Spack not to build any of the MPI providers.
This is kind of annoying, and I would like to fix it.
Yep.
Try BI. Quick question. So when Spack does this kind of like overriding user set their expectations, does it print out some sort of warning message saying that, hey, I'm overriding this, or do I have to like check what happened afterwards?
Currently, you can look at what happens with spec, but I mean, it doesn't print out a message if it chooses something that wasn't like your first choice.
That's
So,
right.
Spack doesn't see itself as overriding what you said in this context. Spack sees this would force me to build things with two different compilers, and that could go wrong. So the default is always to try to build things with the same compiler. If you want to build things with different compilers, you're always going to have to tell Spack very explicitly to do so.
So one of the issues that we have seen in the past is that if things runs fine, the user automatically assumes that what I told happened, and they might realize much later that, oops, I'm running with X instead of Y. So at least printing a warning message or failing might make the user sit up and take notice.
So we will, if you say %GCC on the command line, that's considered a hard constraint.
Yeah.
So it'll fail if it won't do that. It's only if you said you didn't care. If the packages.yaml settings that are stopped, right? So if you put in your packages.yaml configuration for GCC to Intel, right? If for some reason it can't use GCC, then it'll fail over to Intel and not warn you. But if you say on the command line that you want GCC, it'll say I can't build with that.
Yeah.
So we have the new concretizer implemented. We should have a much better facility for error reporting. Because it's actually fairly complicated to track all the conflicts that may have arisen when you search combinatorial space.
Yeah, based on deployment and the errors that people typically run into. These are like some typical things that we see happen. If we don't force the user to sit up and take notice, they will assume things are fine.
So one thing that I would generally recommend to a facility is if you want all of your users to use the MPIs that you're putting out there, put this buildable false for all of the MPIs in the site, the system, etc Spack config scope. And then your users would have to really try to override that.
But they can.
They can.
Yeah.
They can put a double colon on it and say ignore what was put up there, if they really want to build their own. So you're not taking away the option, but you are making it so that unless they really try to, they'll always get the MPIs from the system.
Or just download something that does it for them. Because they don't ever do that.
So now, if we try again, now we've actually told it, okay, I want HDF5 with Clang, but I want mpitch to always be, we want MPI to always be the specific mpitch that we said, even though that's a different compiler. Does that make sense? Any more questions on configuring externals? Yeah.
Does the part you don't specify ever change over time, or is it?
You mean like?
I'm just wondering if there are sort of background changes in the definition of what you'll get when things concretize.
So, between different versions of Spack, yes. But if you stay on a release branch, if you stay at a given release, it will not change. So for example, what the person who packaged mpitch said the default for Hydra should be could change between versions.
Okay.
But it's always going to look in the package, check that default, then look in your package preferences to see if it should update to a package preference, etc.
So there's like kind of a trade-off there in the sense that currently what we default to is what's in the packages, and with the new concretizer we'll provide another option, which is basically, which will probably be the default, which is if what you have installed satisfies what the user asked for, then reuse it. And so the trade-off is that that's stateful, and it's not as deterministic as just going from the packages. And so we would offer both of those options, but they each have their benefits. So
I mentioned earlier the installation permissions. You can set a group. So maybe you have something that's licensed, you're paying for it, you only want the group that's actually paying for it to be able to use it. You can set, for a given package, the permissions, set the read permissions to group, and set the group to whatever Unix group you want.
The person doing that in config would be a member of that group?
The person running it would need to have privileges to change group something to that. So either they would need to be a member of that group, or you could run, sudo Spack.
But you don't do that behind the scenes.
No, we do not run sudo behind the scenes at all. Everything is done with the permissions of the user who's running Spack. All right, so now we've got a big old warning in our script. Make sure to delete this packages.yaml, because otherwise, later in the tutorial, we will start trying to build things from source to satisfy these preferences instead of downloading the binaries that we prepared so that we didn't have to wait for things to build. So rm tilde.spack packages.yaml. Okay. So the high-level config. There are some things, sort of high-level behaviors of Spack that you can also configure in various ways. We've touched on this very briefly. Someone asked about setting the prefix that Spack installs to. And the first thing, if you open, so Spack config, scope defaults, edit config, first thing in this file is the prefix that Spack installs to. Right, so you can change the overall prefix within which Spack has its own way of deciding what the path should be to something. Template directories, we'll talk about that more in the modules portion. The install path scheme. This is how Spack decides within the prefix how to create the prefix for a given package. And so, right, we've seen this. We've seen the architecture, compiler, package version hash. There's actually a nicer syntax you can use now to specify this in the tip of develop, but not in the release branch. And you can change this. Now, sometimes your first instinct might be to get rid of the hash there. That's maybe not the greatest idea, because you might start running into package conflicts where you're trying to install to the same prefix and run into trouble that way. So we generally would recommend keeping the hash there, and if you want a way to look at the packages without the hash, we have something called a Filesystem View, which we will not talk about much today, but that you can use to set up a symlink tree to have sort of where you install your packages has all of the combinatorial space you could possibly need, and then you can set up a symlink tree that you've configured to have enough combinatorial space for right now, but it's easy to blow that away and recreate it with a little more combinatorial versioning if you start installing things that are going to conflict. And so I would generally recommend not playing with this, but playing with file system views instead if you need that. Module roots. Where do I put the module files that I generate? For TCL, for LMOD, for .kit. I don't think anyone outside of Livermore uses .kit. I don't think anyone at Livermore uses it anymore. Build stage. So this is a list of preferences. Where are we going to build the packages? So we download the source somewhere, we build it, then we install it into the install prefix. And we have tempter first, because usually that's a faster file system. And compilation is I/O bound. We try to stick it out on a faster file system just so it goes a little quicker. You can have environment variables in these paths. You can have some extra variables for Spack. That's the prefix of Spack. So environment variable, Spack prefix. And var Spack stage in the Spack prefix is the kind of fallback if all else fails. Yes?
Are the sigil names internal Spack variables, or are you referencing the previous?
These?
Yeah.
So these two are things that Spack will always define for you that you can use in these. This one's the environment variable tempter.
Oh, there's one case.
If the tempter,
Well, that's a special one for what Python thinks the temporary directory is, which typically comes from temporary directory.
okay, so then all three of these are the three. Do we have them for?
There's a very small number of special ones.
Yeah.
And those,
We have it somewhere in our documentation whether there are more than these three. But then you can also do expansions, right? We've got tilde down here, and you can put environment variables case sensitive still. Yep.
Is it safe to modify these YAML files directly, or do you need to use the edit config?
You can modify them directly. I would not modify the default one. If you want to modify something from this, just override it with a higher precedence scope.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, you don't need to use the config edit command. In fact, if you mess up one of these so badly that YAML can't parse it, Spack will not load, and you will have to edit it manually, and that's what you saw me have to do when I left the tab in on the last line.
basically, if you edit the default directory, if you get a version in Git, and if you pull a new version of Spack or something, then it'll conflict with your change. Whereas if you edit, so this is an SE-Spack default. If you edit the thing in SE-Spack, then we ignore that directory entirely except for the default part. And so you can override anything here.
Yep.
Okay. And then not have conflict.
The source cache is, every time you download something, Spack actually creates a mirror internally for you so that you don't have to download the same things again. Miscellaneous cache for random stuff that we cache to speed things up. Verify SSL, checksums, dirty. I would not recommend overriding any of those. Some people override dirty to allow environment variables that Spack generally cleans for you into their builds. I would never recommend it, but it's available. You can change the language, use locking. Build jobs. You notice this is commented out here. It's just there so you can see how to use it. I said by default we cap the number of build jobs at 16, but we'll use however many up to 16 are available. Threads are available on the chip.
That's in develop, not this release though.
Oh yeah, this release it will use everything. In develop we've capped it at 16. You can use build jobs to change that. And then some stuff that we probably shouldn't need to worry about, but it's there if you need it for lock timeouts, etc. So that is all. I could go through an example of changing the build jobs and showing you that it actually changes, but I think that's probably not necessary. So any questions here? Yeah.
What determines the value of $Spack if Spack root is not set?
Spack knows, so Python executables know where they live.
Right.
So it can check, the executable checks for what is, I forget whether it's 2 or 4 levels of the file system directory above it, and it makes that $Spack.
It assumes that Spack lives inside of bin within. And so, yeah, the Spack root is really only necessary if you're sourcing the CSH set of files.
Yeah.
Because D shell doesn't know how to find its own source script. Well, then that sounds like a great contribution. We have it working for all the SH. We have it for Dash, C Shell, and Bash, but
Any other questions on configuring Spack?
So in order to, going back to the prefix question,
Uh-huh.
do I have to hard code it, or then can I set a stack route different from the get directory from where the stack is?
Yeah. So you could put like /opt there
Okay.
if you wanted to do a system install, and you could put any sort of environment variable in here as well. If you wanted it to be different, you could put the host name in here if you wanted it to be different based on what host you're on. That might mess Spack up a little bit if you then ran, what the reindex command to regenerate the database, but you could do it.
Just kind of in the trenches question, do you envision people having lots of these config files laying around, like one for maybe every group or every even package install, or?
So you can have the separate packages in the same config file. I would not anticipate having a lot of these floating around. For our proprietary packages at Livermore, we basically have one that has all the compilers they care about. I say basically because there are groups that insist on renaming their compilers to weird things, and they can do their own thing. But in general, we've only needed one for just about everything we've done. I think it would be really common to have, the facilities people who are installing sort of a broad range of stuff have one, and then users using something else to build on top of that. That would be pretty common. Something that we haven't mentioned because it's not in this release, but is in develop, is you can now set upstreams using the same sort of configuration stuff where you can say, okay, I know that facilities people deployed stuff with Spack. I have my Spack. Here's their Spack. Go use that stuff if it's available and only build it if it's not. And you can do that using the configuration system as well. Anything else? I think it's lunchtime then.
Right, a quick notice, we're planning on just walking up in here during lunch. The guys in the office across the way should be able to unlock it, but if you want to have access to your laptop or your backpack, you can take it with you, or we'll unlock it and people need to get back in. But it's just in terms of being able to go out without lugging stuff around, that's settled on for now.
Unfortunately, I modified that if like this. So can you take a different copy of that, maybe in like in scratch? Yeah. The so I want to see how you're getting the various how the versions of that flag, C flag, P flag, and things like that, so that I can build it. So I'm able to build it now. I'm hoping that like I will do Minecraft launch actually tomorrow.
Yeah. Yeah, I'll put that.
Right, so if they already have the banner rate, they will create how we as the archive.
Well, so if you want to create a binary package with Spack, you need to have at least a recipe like internal to yours, right? So AMD would make a private file to show and build a Spack package and say build cache right? You don't have to import, you don't have to make source code. You probably need to make a and just binary. And then, I mean, that's handled by Spack.
Okay, so suppose we have, let's say, we have configuration for this and all, if that's all you need,
basically,
it was basically
One is just being served upstairs on the fourth floor, just like go upstairs and you double check this way.
no, I guess what you're saying, typically for two-person things move much faster.
It'll make them,
And once I go back, other things will keep coming down.
Yeah.
We can leave stuff here, right? Perfect.
Binary.
okay, yeah.
So, Spack has a way in which we can define, so it's not an RCM, it's a Spack binary format, so that was what I was checking with Todd about earlier. So what we can do is, this is my plan. I would like to generate various Spack binaries for the different versions we have, create a repo on the mapping site, so that users, just like you said, like yum and repo or something like that, so that you can add the repo and put, say, mapps 2x23 or install, then what are
But if I
Right? Unless it's
I mean, if I don't specify before the word is like, if I specify, yeah.
Like a whole bunch of this stuff.
So you can say, that's a whole thing, five or higher.
Right. But I think if I don't specify,
And we define it. So we know it just gets defined.
I don't define it.
Argonne came back and said.
If you don't
There are
specify,
getting
you have to have
used
If you have two versions that depend on the what the version was.
Yeah, I'm not, yeah.
Not just very
That
means, like, years back playing.
Like the newer version of AI, and
Yeah.
start the installation. They're trying to
We probably don't.
But if you install that as an external, you'll just, I mean, if you didn't specify it at all.
I don't use it basically.
Well, then, I mean, then you have dependencies outside your package, and you have, right, and the user has to make sure there's, to some extent, like you have a not fully specified section.
Right, yeah.
And I guess you can provide that. It may frustrate the users, right?
Right, but, you know, yes, if I look at all the things,
When you go.
because I absolutely,
When you go into.
I mean, especially for the
Everyone.
Oh, I see, so you're saying like you, yeah,
Like,
and so,
you want.
we're working on ways to be able to. Pretty clear about it. Yeah, we should talk about that. That's something that some other vendors.
yeah, like our package.